I am really pleased to be able to be kicking off this day. You know, just look around you. We have had such an overwhelming response to this event. And at first, like, we are double sold out. I think we're going to be seeing tremendous people in and out of this room throughout the day. And at first, my colleagues and I were surprised by that a little bit. But then we really thought about it, and we saw it for what it was, which is a tremendous desire amongst all of us to learn more about a very new approach to our economic policy making, how we think about our economy differently, and then what we do differently. Tom Perriello has said that this is, in fact, the greatest governing moment of his political lifetime. And I think that that is right, and we're here today to talk about all that that might mean. So, before I say more, I will note that this event is on the record. You are more than invited to tweet out highlights from the event. The hashtag is #IndustrialPolicy2022. And please tag us at Roosevelt Inst. And I also want to make sure to recognize the Kimpton Monaco workers and the Roosevelt Institute staff who are here working extremely hard to make this event special. We've got union members here with Unite Here Local 25 and the new MBs leading the cheers, and News Guild Local 31003. So. Okay, so we are living in an industrial policy moment. And we used to say that industrial policy was like that thing that we couldn't talk about. The IMF called it the policy that shall not be named. But in a remarkable turn of affairs today, industrial policy is the explicit agenda of the Biden administration. And this enormous shift was driven by a lot of things. By the pandemic, by supply chain crises, by a different recognition of the climate crisis, and by international security concerns. And it came in part from the recognition that we are no longer in control of the critical industrial resources that our economy needs, and from the recognition that our old ways of doing business and managing or not managing the economy were driving pollution, were driving inequality, and that some communities, those with the least power, were getting the brunt of it. So thinking has to shift, power has to shift, and people have to shift. So we hear this new thing called by a lot of different names. Brian Deese insists that this is industrial strategy. Danny Roderick calls it the new productivism. Ezra Klein says that this is a liberalism that builds. He puts a question mark after that. I think we need to put an exclamation point, and that's what we're here to talk about. But whatever you call it, the industrial policy in focus today has a few key features that make it worthwhile to spend a day in this ballroom with a lot of keynotes and panels. First and foremost, putting an end to the myth that the US has ever operated on purely free market principles. That's just never been true. We've long had ad hoc measures that amount to an industrial policy. It's just been one for a long time because we didn't talk about it. That's what happens when you don't talk about things. It ends up favoring the people who are already connected, who already know how things are wired, and usually who are already wealthy. So that's why we have to talk about it. Second principle, today's industrial policy thinkers view the government, the state, as having a central role to play. The state has to resolve questions like which industries rise and fall, or at least have a really strong view on which industries rise and fall, how they're structured, how they produce goods, and how they make sure that our citizens are dialed in and read in to this set of decisions. Which leads me to my last point, and the point that I usually talk about the most, which is that today's industrial policy must be genuinely democratic, small d. So it's important to note that years of hard work by thinkers and doers brought us to today. Many of you are veterans of these battles, right? The global justice movement of the 1990s. I don't know how many of you were in Seattle then, but you know, and at least a few of you were, I know that. The Occupy Wall Street movement in the 2000s. And then most recently and most excitingly, the tremendous energy around a Green New Deal in the last 5 years. It is impossible to imagine this transformation without the environmental justice and equity and worker justice advocates who have brought this moment to the fore. And we owe it to them, and frankly, we owe it to ourselves to make sure that the power shift that they are calling for is real. We've already netted a number of wins. I'm going to list some of them, and we'll talk about more of them throughout the day. $369 billion in clean energy and $250 billion in lending under the Inflation Reduction Act. $52 billion for the semiconductor industry and $170 billion in all kinds of exciting research in the Chips and Science Act. $550 billion in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And executive branch actions, which need to be layered onto this, right? Supply chain reviews, the invocation of the Defense Production Act, and of course, all of the race equity and competition policy work that this administration has put on the table early. This is all, of course, bolstered by the $80 billion in new taxation funds, meaning literally funds to improve our ability to tax. That will pay for all this, which is really important because our tax system is the backbone of a healthy economy and will ensure, if we do it right, that this transition is more just and more fair. So many of the people who are charged with leading all of these efforts are here today. They'll be here throughout the day, and it is exciting because what we have before us is a $4 trillion opportunity. Okay, I know I'm rounding up because those numbers I just said don't really add up to $4 trillion, but the reason I round up is because I also count all of the money in the American Rescue Plan, along with the 3 subsequent pieces of legislation. And the reason it is important to think about it that way is that at this kind of scale, right, what we do next with that money, which has been allocated but not yet meaningfully spent, what we do next locks in our next economy. The choices we make about how that money flows, to which communities, with which communities, who has oversight and how, which federal agencies, which agencies are built, which agencies are rebuilt, how agencies work with each other, how government up and down our federal system, governments up and down our federal system really work. This is going to hardwire power in place for at least a generation, and it will be much harder to rewire once that is in place, and that is why we are having this conversation today. So, we are going to look at all of the hard work ahead that remains. Implementation, which in a lot of ways, for a lot of you implementation nerds out there, is the whole ball game. It's going to be very challenging. We're going to be looking at and talking about how to close the remaining estimated gap in U.S. climate obligations. I think perhaps we'll hear more about that in just a second. And we are going to talk about centering equity and uplifting the industries like the care industry, which had long been on the Biden administration's high care, low carbon agenda, but have not yet made it through legislation and that await their industrial policy moment. So now, you've heard enough from me. Without further ado, I am going to introduce a person who needs no introduction, but I am pleased to and obliged to give him one anyway. I'm going to welcome to the stage John Podesta. As you all know, John is now the Senior Advisor to President Biden for Clean Energy Innovation and Implementation. That's a job he took in early September. His track record is astounding and makes him the perfect person for this job. He's the founder and former chair for the think tank, the two think tanks, the Center for American Progress and the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I love it, John, that you are a friend of the think tank community. That's really important. John served as the counselor to President Barack Obama, where he was responsible for coordinating the administration's climate and policy initiatives. Of course, he was previously the White House Chief of Staff for President Clinton. He was chair of Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign for the presidency. He hails from Chicago. He's a graduate of Knox College and the Georgetown University School of Law, where he is also currently, in his spare time, a visiting professor of law. John will have a few remarks, and then we're actually going to take questions. There are note cards provided on your table. Write down your questions, raise them up. A staff member will come collect questions, and then I'll moderate some Q&A. So without further ado, John Podesta.